Hi, Rick here. I've been compiling research to work on my eventual breakdown of the Constitution class, but there are many roadblocks when you start digging into the lore of such a long-running franchise as Star Trek. Some of them I already knew, but did not know the scale. For example, did you know the original series Enterprise had no warp core? The original premise of the warp core was not even finalised when the original series began airing. This is something that you can see when the drive is called out as a time warp factors, as it was supposed to compensate for time dilation effects that could occur during faster than light travel. The source of power was also never cemented until later on, with it being clear that nuclear power would not have been enough. Matter-antimatter annihilation was settled on as being a suitably grandiose form of energy to bend space-time, and after that made its way into the show's dialogue, it was canon. Despite the occasional reference to dilithium crystals as a power source too. Because of this, there was not a warp core as such mentioned in the original series. But first off, let's define just what we mean with a warp core. After all, a warp system encapsulates everything from antimatter containment to the nacelles and all the electroplasma in between, but a warp core, as conceptualised in the Next Generation era, was the point where matter and antimatter reacted in the intermix chamber, a single part of the whole apparatus, but arguably the most important point and the heart of the whole reaction. The nacelles were the only system that was clearly labelled as part of the warp drive in both dialogue and in-universe diagrams. When they were originally created, Matt Jeffries theorised that any machine powerful enough to fold space-time would likely be incredibly dangerous, possibly radioactive, and therefore should not be running through the inhabited areas of a spaceship. Because of this, they were placed well away from the hull on extended pylons, and the iconic shape was born. However, a central engineer's room was needed for the show, which meant that there had to be a single point for the crew to busy themselves in, and the nacelles therefore could not be the whole engine system. Unless there were always two of these engine rooms, one in each nacelle, and the red background we see is inside of the nacelle? Probably not, but we'll put a pin in that for now. In dialogue, the nacelles are expressly referred to as matter-antimatter nacelles, which suggests that the warp reaction, the intermixing of opposite elements, takes place within the nacelles themselves. Doesn't this then place the warp cores in each nacelle, which is in keeping with the original idea of containing all the dangerous technology away from the vessel? In fact, it's clear throughout that the nacelles are the warp engines that are often referred to and originally conceptualised as the whole drive, from antimatter reactions to folding space. One thing for certain is that the original main engineering did not house a warp core. In fact, in Series 1, it did not even house the dilithium crystals, as there was a separate dilithium energizer room that contained them. Now, they would later be incorporated into main engineering rooms, however. In fact, the placement of main engineering was not locked in either, with the making of Star Trek referencing that it was located nearby the main impulse engines, which were labelled clearly as being on the saucer section within the primary hull of the ship. Early schematics of the Enterprise, made for licensed merchandise therefore, also placed Scotty's engine room there at the rear of the saucer section. This means that the long red hallway of tubes we see in the back of main engineering is not the inside of a nacelle, but the impulse engines? However, this is inconsistently shown throughout the original series, with Scotty referring to it as both impulse and warp drive separately. Then it was referenced as a series of warp plasma conduits. On top of this, we see in Day of the Dove an energy being leave engineering through the hull, exiting from the lower half of the Enterprise. I'm assuming it did not detour through the neck just to leave by the deflector, so the engine room is in the secondary hull. Admittedly, placing the engine room in either location makes sense. In the saucer, well then it still has power should it separate. In the secondary hull, it's closer to the nacelles and there's less distance to convey the energy. Alright, so we've established that the location of engineering was floaty for a while, and that the equipment and tech we see in the original series was not penned in but merely changing dependent on plot. Shocker. However, as time moved on, things were retroactively inserted into the lore as retcons. The look of the Klingons, for example, and this extended to how warp drive worked. Now the warp reactor, as seen in the motion picture, is actually more codified in lore, and there is very little discrepancy in where it was located and how it functioned. By this time, the behind-the-scenes lore had been mostly ironed out into a consistent sci-fi premise, and we had a reliable blueprint for how warp travel would work going forwards in Star Trek. We have the in-universe justification of the refit to explain any modifications here, but it shows the system running from the impulse drive, down the neck and into the secondary hull, more or less in the front half, with a long conduit leading towards the aft. The next generation really solidified it into the system we know, necessitating the inclusion of a warp core, which was later incorporated in the prequel series of Enterprise 2. When Doug Drexler was required to construct a detailed Master Systems display for the Constitution class Defiant that featured in a Mirror Darkly, he placed main engineering between the two warp pylons at their base, linking the top of the console in main engineering to a towering intermix chamber that ran below it. This was effectively the warp system's intermix chamber, with the resulting warp plasma flowing up through those 10 conduits behind the engine room, then into the pylons and to the nacelles. Inconsistencies, such as naming them the antimatter nacelles, references to engineering being in the saucer section, and more, would just have to be chalked up to simply, it's a show that was still finding its legs, it's just not going to all line up. Now, with Strange New Worlds added into the mix, they've placed main engineering in a separate location and scaled up the Enterprise with another potential retcon. Separate topic. But the location of the engine room here is in the secondary hull, but in the fore of the vessel, lining up with the Day of the Dove Energy Creature's departure and the motion picture refit. We can see from a behind-the-scenes cutaway that the cavernous hall we see still contains plasma conduits, but these are depicted as behind the main deflector, with power conduits running up through the neck and towards the rear of the vessel, lining up more or less with the motion picture overhaul. Sure, the look and scale are different, but as I said, that's a separate topic. The latest additions to the canon adhere to the established lore of the next generation, but the shaky ground of the original TOS means that any explanation that's not purposefully vague or full of caveats is going to conflict with other sources from that era. So, where is main engineering and the warp core in the original Enterprise? It's in the saucer section, except when it was in the main hull behind the deflector, or between the nacelles, or even in the nacelles. No wonder Scotty had his hands full. In some ways, I like the less definitive explanation for the warp drive of the original series. It gives it this less centralised feel that makes it feel more like a primitive version of the warp core idea. The towering glow tubes that we all know and love now seem like a condensed advancement of a system that was originally spread throughout half a starship. And that's kind of reflective of the evolution of the lore too. The next generation might have painted the picture, but it was the original series that purchased the brush and paints. Thanks for watching this examination of the original warp drive. I've been Rick, and until the next one, thanks again, and goodbye.